Hey folks, Jack from Moonshift Audio here. Today I want to talk about rules in music production and mixing. People love rules. People who know what they're doing, and some people who don't, love laying down the law and saying, when you're mixing a vocal, you should always compress like this. Or when you're mixing a vocal, you should always cut these frequencies and boost these frequencies. And people who are learning their craft like hearing these rules because it's reassuring and sometimes helpful to feel like if I'm mixing a vocal and I'm not that experienced, then if I EQ like this and I compress like this, it's going to come out great. Sometimes these rules are right, and I'm not here to tell you this is all a load of rubbish. To be fair, I do read on social media and on forums and stuff quite a lot of things that people are writing that is like straight up wrong, sometimes hilariously wrong. But I'm not going to get into that today. I want to look at some rules that I think are generally agreed to be good and sort of worth following, because I don't always agree. For a start, I don't really believe in hard and fast rules in a creative space like this. And as they say, rules are made to be broken, but there are a few rules that I hear a lot that I break all the time. So here's a little look at some of those. The first one is using the solo button. This is one I hear all the time. Never mix in solo. It's the golden rule of mixing. You know what? Solo is really useful, and I think people get put off using it. And like for a long time, I was sort of feeling guilty every time I put something in solo. And that's fucking rubbish because, it's there for a reason. And it's there for a good reason. If I'm working on a mix and I hear something in there that's not sounding right, then what I'll often do is I'll use solo to find it. I'll solo that vocal and I'll be like, oh yeah, there is actually a bit of muddiness on that particular phrase there. I need to get it out. And it's quite difficult to hear that in the mix when you've got loads of other things going on. Sometimes you solo the vocal and the vocal's fine. And you're like, oh, okay, so it must be coming from somewhere else. Let's check out that guitar or that synth. Maybe there's some like ugly build up down in the lower end of that. But solo is useful to find it. I think what people are really saying when they say don't mix in solo is don't do your work in solo. Or if you do your work in solo, make sure you check it and sign it off in the context of the mix. I think this rule can be useful, especially if you're starting out, because, when I was starting out, I used solo a lot and I was definitely guilty of soloing the drums, getting the drum sounding really good, then soloing the guitar, getting the guitar sounding really good, then doing the vocal, and so on and so on and so on. And then you unsolo everything and you listen to the mix and it's just a big mess because nothing's fitting around each other, nothing is being worked on in the context of the overall mix. So don't mix in solo, but absolutely use solo. Talk to any live sound engineer and ask them how often they use the puffle, the pre-fader listen. It's an essential tool for anyone, and that's kind of the live sound equivalent of a solo button. It's useful, so don't be afraid to use solo. Next up, wide bass. I hear a lot that, your bass has to be in mono. Everything below 100 hertz has to be in mono. And yeah, there is an argument for that. But there's also an argument to say, if it sounds good, it is good. And if you want to have some stereo information down there, or you want to pan your kick drum slightly to one side and your bass slightly to the other side, that's absolutely fine. A lot of people would be like, oh yeah, but what about it's getting played in a club? It has to be mono, it has to be mono. And it's like, I do appreciate that. It is nice to have a solid low end, but not every track is designed to be a dance floor club banger. If you've got a nice ballad or a bit of jazz or folk or anything like that, then absolutely listen to some of those old recordings from the 70s and earlier where you've got all the drums on one side of the mix, hard left or hard right, and all of the other instruments on the other side. If you listen to them on a stereo, they sound fantastic. Sometimes they sound good in headphones as well. So yes, there is an argument to say that your bass should be in mono, but you don't have to religiously stick to that. You can play around with it. And if you do start experimenting and doing something a little bit different with these rules and you can get it to work, then your track is going to have a lot more interest going on for it as a result of that. Okay, rule number 3, high passing every element in the mix apart from the bass and the kick. This was actually taught to me when I studied at uni, and I used to do this religiously. Absolutely everything. If it's not the kick or the bass, roll it off. High pass filter at 100 hertz. Nothing should be down there that isn't part of those two elements. And then I got into mid-side EQing, and I was like, oh wow, we can take the sides even higher. Let's high pass them up to 130 hertz. And what I found was, after doing this for quite a long time, my mixes were just sounding really, really scooped and a bit lifeless because there are so many elements. Like vocals have information below 100 hertz. Guitars go way down there. Pianos, keys, so many synths, all the rest of it. And sure, if you've got lows going on in all of those elements and they're all filling up the bottom of your mix, then you might need to do some scooping out. These days, I actually prefer a low shelf or a very, very gentle filter, like 8 dB an octave or something like that. Because if you absolutely clinically strip out all the low end from all these other elements, you just get this kind of empty, slightly sterile feel. And, that can be good if you're doing some kind of like very precise minimal techno or drum and bass or something like that. But if you're producing a song and, something that has got a bit more of a human element and you want a bit of warmth and you want a bit of a retro vibe, then play around with just not doing that. Try leaving a bit of low end in. And if you do have to get rid of some, try just reducing it with a low shelf rather than just like stripping it all away completely with a high pass filter. You might find that your mixes start to sound a little bit more rounded, a bit fuller, and just generally a bit more real if you do that. Okay, rule number 4, mixing as you produce. I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, you should never mix as you produce. You should always export everything as audio and then bring it into a new session and then you can start the mix off clean and you'll be free of all the distractions of your mix. But I kind of think that's bollocks. I'm always mixing as I'm producing. And the reason for that is I want to know how things are going to sound. If I've just made a synth patch and I'm programming the line for that and it's got loads and loads of bass or the volume is a bit all over the place and I know that in the mix I'm going to be compressing that and I'm going to be pulling out some of the lows or I'm going to be boosting some of the highs so it gets a sparkle on it, then I want to hear that when I'm producing. I want to build my arrangement knowing how all the elements in it are going to sound. So sure, I'm not going to get into the absolute nitty gritty and doing all really precise little corrective tweaks that I might do in the final mix, but I will do a lot of that in the production stage so that as the song takes shape, as I build the arrangement, everything sounds how it's actually going to sound. I don't want to have to hold in my head, oh yeah, but in the mix that'll be compressed and it'll sound more full. Just do it now. Then I've got that as context for everything else that I'm doing. The same goes with effects processing and that sort of thing. I'm absolutely going to be EQing my reverb returns in the production phase because otherwise I have to spend hours listening to this muddy soup coming out of my reverb while I'm trying to get on and produce the other elements of the track. Make sense? Okay, this last one I think might be a bit controversial, but it's gain staging. Gain staging feels like it was a bit of a buzzword in 2023, and I still hear people talking about it all the time. But honestly, I think it's kind of a lot of hype about nothing. Sure, some analog modeling plugins might react a little bit differently if the signal coming into them isn't kind of optimized, but there's very few that really work in that way. And if you're getting a little bit of extra saturation, then you should hear that and you can correct for it. A much better argument for gain staging is that things sound better when they're louder. And that is absolutely true. If you're trying to do some kind of critical listening and you're running something into a distortion and it gets louder, then it's going to sound better. And that is going to affect the way you decide if you're doing a good thing to the audio or not. So auto gain is useful. Gain staging is useful in that way. But you know what? Sometimes I just don't bother. For example, if I've got a vocal and I'm going to run it into an LA2A, like I often do to get some nice creamy compression on there, those compressors are voiced loud and they're voiced quite bright. And a lot of the time, when I'm first compressing a vocal, I'm trying to get more volume out of it. So I know that that compressor is going to make it louder and I don't mind if it does. I'm still listening critically. I'm still making sure if anything sticks out that doesn't sound right to me, I'm there to address it. But I'm not going to be getting in there painstakingly turning down the output gain as I turn up the input gain to make sure it doesn't get any louder because I just don't need to. I think an analogy that I could use for this is with cooking. Like if you're doing a new recipe for the first time, then you're going to be looking at the cookbook all the time and it's quite a slow and painstaking process. I don't want to put too much garlic in this because I want it to come out how it's supposed to. But when you've cooked that recipe 8 times before, I'm not getting the recipe book out anymore. I know what's going to happen when I put those 3 cloves of garlic in there. I know if I put 5 in, it's going to be too garlicky. I know if I put 1 in, it's not going to be garlicky enough. I've learned the outcomes of what I'm doing. So with this compressor, I know what's going to happen to that vocal when I feed into it and I knock 6 dBs off. I don't need to painstakingly lower the output gain to gain match to hear what it's going to do to that vocal because I've done it hundreds of times before and I know the result I'm trying to get. Spending too long trying to perfectly level match the output from any plugin to another is actually going to take me out of the flow that I've got in the mix, and that's much more damaging than having a little bit of a discrepancy in gain. At the end of the day, if I'm happy with the end result, I don't really mind how I got there. So those are the 5 rules I'm breaking all the time in my mixing. I wonder if maybe you can see a common theme there. These rules are useful as guidelines and they're good when you're starting out, but when you get a bit further along and you start to get more of a kind of instinctive feel for what you're doing, then it's worth taking a step back and just thinking, do I really need to do this? Or even worse, are my mixes starting to be hurt by me religiously following these rules? question everything. If you've got any rules that you think are particularly useful or rules that you break all the time, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I'll be back next week with another video, so please do like and subscribe. Till next time.